Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third lecture here in Chapter 17 on the Renaissance and the Reformation. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Reformation and the role that Martin Luther played in it, and we'll also start talking about how it spreads a little bit. We'll focus more about the spread of the Reformation in our final lecture in this unit. So let's get started. All right, so we're going to talk about the causes of the Reformation here on the next two slides. This one's going to be more broad, and we'll be more focused on the next one. So you have to think back to one of the main causes of the Reformation is the Renaissance, the ideas that were coming out of the Renaissance, the new forms of learning and all this stuff, and more importantly, the individuality and the idea of questioning what was going on, whether it was politics or culture or the church. You start seeing this identity of individuality and questioning of things start to challenge, in this case, the church's authority. Now, the Renaissance, and then as well as the Reformation, the spread of ideas, is going to be aided by one invention in particular, and that's the printing press. And you have to think about it. Why? I mean, it's pretty obvious. You have more information that's being spread to the public, and therefore it allows people to have more access to what's going on, the ideas, the questioning, and so forth. So the printing press, really important in helping to spread new ideas, in particular here, the ideas of the Reformation. The other part of it, too, is that you have various states that are in control across Europe, which makes it very hard for one entity to have control, whether it's the church or whether it's a single state. So in the case of Germany, this is really hard because, as you guys remember, Germany is not this unified state like we can see in France or even in England. It's made up of hundreds, if not close to 1,000 mini states or duchies and so forth. So it's very difficult to control this area. So that means there's a lot of different ideas, and it's easy for things to spread and or difficult to control things. And the other part of it too is you have a rising northern merchant class because of the riches of the Renaissance that actually start resenting paying taxes. And when you combine it with what we talk about here in the role that money is going to play in the church, or how it's going to increase its role in the church, merchants are not going to like it. Because as we know in history, nobody likes to pay taxes. I mean, nobody does anyways. All right, so this leads us to a little bit more in terms of reason to reform. And if I haven't mentioned it already, these two slides, this one and the previous one, please do make sure you guys star them and know them. They're very, very important. So some furthermore reasons for reform, or reasons for the Reformation to actually take place, is that the popes are corrupt, or there's increasing number of popes or religious figures, whether it's cardinals or archbishops or priests or whatever, are leading more lavish lives, going against the traditional idea of vow of poverty, and there is some corruption. You start seeing the churches actually fighting, and when I mean fighting, they are financing and yielding forces to actually expand their own interests in lands militarily. They're actually killing people and undertaking campaigns from a military standpoint, which leads to many people wanting reforms. You also see an increased amount of taxes and the idea of selling indulgences. More on that later, but most importantly here, it pushes the reasons for reform, because you can see that the church is being driven more by its greed and its want for money. And then you also, because of all these things, have a growing number of Christians who start to protest these practices and urge a return to the older, more traditional practices that have been in place. And all of this results in several revolts that are against the church. Whether they're small or large, they're all going to kind of be melded into what we know as the Protestant Reformation here. All right, so let's talk about the beginnings. First off, in terms of the church being viewed as corrupt, we've kind of already briefly touched on some of this, but we see that they are starting to use money for wars, money for pleasurable goods, and then actually something that helped the Renaissance spread and become more popular, they're using their money for the arts, commissioning buildings, commissioning sculptures, paintings, and so forth, which is actually a good thing culturally over time, but some people view this as corruption because they're using their wealth to show things off. You see a pope in Alexander VI actually fathered children when he's not even supposed to. He has a vow of celibacy. And then you also see monks and priests who had for long periods of time been really the sole source of education in Europe start to actually go push education by the wayside because they're more focused on their pleasurable goods and living life and showing off their power rather than being educated. So you see poorly educated religious figures, and that's a problem. So you see men like John Wycliffe or Jan Hus or even Thomas More and Erasmus start to actually criticize the church, and this fuels an atmosphere for questioning and revolt and change. So now on to Martin Luther, and Martin Luther is the key figure here when we talk about the Reformation. You have to know who he is, and you have to know what the 95 Theses are. Now, Martin Luther was a professor of scripture at Wittenberg University, and he believed that faith was the key to salvation. So therefore, he believed that if you wanted to achieve eternity in heaven, that you needed to practice the faith of Christianity and follow it to its letter. Now, what ultimately set Luther off, there were a number of things, but ultimately he was really angered by the practice of the church selling indulgences or pardons into heaven. So basically, he was upset by Johann Tetzel, the bishop there, was tricking people into thinking that they could buy their way into heaven or buy a pardon or an indulgence to receive their pass into heaven. And he said that was wrong, that you couldn't spend money to buy your place in heaven. So what Luther does is he responds with writing what is known as his 95 Theses. And he famously, who knows if he actually traditionally did this in its way, but it was very dramatic in its story, is on Halloween Day in 1517. He marches up to the door of the church in Wittenberg and hammers his 95 Theses onto the door of the church and starts debating them with the people around. And this is the beginning of the Reformation, the point that we look as change for the church. And we see a rise of churches that start to not accepting, or they won't accept the Pope's authority. And this is going to be a huge change for Christianity in its history. So Luther, what is he talking about? What is he teaching? Well, he was pushing for a complete reform of the church, and he was focused on three main ideas. One, that you could only achieve your place in heaven or salvation only by God's forgiveness. Two, all teachings had to be based through the Bible, not through priests or bishops or even the Pope. They could only come from the actual religious text itself. And three, that all people with faith or who practice Christianity were equal regardless of their class standing, if they were a poor or if they were a king. And this is important because that equality is what allows his ideas to spread rapidly and gain many followers very quickly, especially when you combine it with all of the other reasons we've talked about people are upset about and the invention of the printing press. All right, so what's the response? Well, Luther suggests in some ways at times that the Pope should be forced out and be forced out through actual physical force. And this is actually really, really controversial and ultimately leads to him being excommunicated by the Pope Leo X, in 1520. And Luther basically just says, I'm not stopping, and he burns these warnings. But what ends up happening is the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, is able to put Luther on trial at Worms, and Luther refuses to recant his positions against the church. And this leads to the Edict of Worms in 1521, where Luther is declared an outlaw and a heretic. Now, before anything can be any punishment can be dealt against him, Luther is able to flee, and he's sheltered by the Frederick of Saxony. And this is important because not only does this give Luther an escape, but it allows him to actually establish his own religious group shortly thereafter, and they're going to call themselves the Lutherans. So anybody that's a Lutheran, or you know of or have met somebody that goes to a Lutheran church, they are a direct result of this change right here. All right, so now this is actually going to lead to some revolts and warfare in Germany. So in 1524, the peasants in Germany actually rise up, not really against religion, but they rise up against the practice of serfdom, and they start to raid, pillage, and burn monasteries and important places in Germany. And this is an important event in the Reformation, because it means that you have another area of where people are upset, and you're going to see them start to mix. Now, Luther is actually really appalled by this and calls for the princes of Germany and its various states to actually crush the peasant revolt, because he doesn't like it, it doesn't support his ideas, and he's appalled by these lower classes and violence. Now, what ends up happening, though, is the princes across Germany are actually split over the ideas of the Reformation, even though they're trying to deal with the peasant revolt. And you can see that this is kind of mixed together, and this leads to some German princes that actually follow the Pope in Rome, and some that will actually go on to follow Luther. And they're going to be known as Protestants as they protest against the Catholic Church. So whether they're Lutheran or Protestant, they're the same thing, just to keep things simple. There are differences, but just to keep things simple, Protestants, Lutheran, they're the same thing from here on out. So I apologize if that gets confusing. Now, what ends up happening is Charles V, he goes to war against the Protestants. He's the Catholic leader of the Holy Roman Empire and has the backing of the Pope. And you actually have a war in Germany between Charles V and the Lutheran or Protestant forces. And Charles V fails to bring the Protestants back under the scope and following of the Catholic Church and the Pope. So what this results in is in 1555, both sides agree to the Peace of Augsburg. And in this agreement, they basically say, look, here in Germany, you have people that follow Lutheranism and you have people that follow Catholicism. Each ruler, you get to decide your own state's religion and allow them to follow it. So basically, you get a choice. Do you want to be Catholic or do you want to be Lutheran? Here you can actually see this is basically what ends up happening across Europe. The yellow is what remains Catholic, and then the red is what either changes to Lutheran or is the Lutheran area of influence in Germany, and then where it spreads to. And you can see here, this is the main area that we're focusing on for the sake of the starting and spread of the Reformation, with Wittenberg here where it all started. And then where Martin Luther was put on trial is here at Worms, and then the Peace of Augsburg was down here. All right, so now on to King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII is going to be an extension of the Reformation and is important because of really the reason that he wanted to get divorced. It's kind of an odd part to this situation. So we're going to be moving on to England. So what you need to know about Henry VIII is he was actually somebody that was a devout Catholic. He ultimately disagreed with Luther's teachings and said that what he was doing was wrong. And he did a number of things to end up getting the nickname Defender of the Faith, Defender of the Catholic Faith, by his actions in supporting the church. He was that devout. There's one problem, though. He needed an heir. He needed to have a male son to pass his bloodline along, and he didn't have one yet. And he didn't want to go to war, and he only had a daughter at the time. But he's married. He's married, and he's afraid his wife isn't she's too old to have a kid. So he needs a divorce, and so he can have other children from another woman, and so forth. Sorry for the typo there in terms of form. But divorce isn't allowed under the Catholic Church, so he asked for his marriage to be annulled. The Pope denies the annulment because Catherine of Aragon is Charles V's, I believe, sister. I'm sorry, it's right there on screen. Catherine's nephew. So they're related. So the Pope doesn't want to offend him, so he doesn't grant him the annulment. So therefore, King Henry's not happy. So what ends up happening is, in 1529, King Henry VIII asks Parliament to pass laws ending the Pope's authority in England, and they do so. But a few years later, Henry decides, I'm going to marry another woman. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and Parliament approves the divorce. And then the Act of Supremacy is passed in 1534, where King Henry VIII is named the head of the Church of England. So you can see he's really going after the authority of the church and who should have control. Excuse me. Now, what ends up happening is we come back to our old friend Thomas More, who we mentioned a little bit earlier, as well as earlier in this chapter, who wrote Utopia. He severely criticizes Henry. He's arrested and then ultimately executed at the Tower of London because of his criticisms against Henry VIII and his actions against the church. So here are the consequences. Anne Boleyn doesn't have a son. She's ultimately charged with treason and beheaded. You guys can read more about this. It's quite interesting. And then in 1537, he marries his third wife, Jane Seymour. She gives birth to a son, which is what he wanted, a son named Edward. But unfortunately, due to some complications, Jane is actually going to die 2 weeks later. Now, Henry will marry 3 more times, but he won't have any more children. And then in 1547, he dies, but each child that he has, male plus the daughters he has, will all go on to rule England for at least a period of time. Now, there are going to be some Protestant reforms. They're going to be added by the advisors of his son, Edward VI, when he takes the crown. Now, his daughter Mary will return to England, or will ultimately return England to the Pope, and kind of lead in this period of unrest between England and the Catholic Church and the Protestant people that follow it. And she even has several Protestants that are actually executed. All right, this brings us to Elizabeth I. She comes in and she wants to return England to Protestantism. So in 1559, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, sets up a compromise because she doesn't want a total bloodbath. She agrees that for Protestants, priests are going to be allowed to marry and they can use English in their sermons, because one of the points of contention was that Catholics believe that you should do everything religiously in Latin, and Protestants said that you should do it in vernacular. But anyways, there's a compromise there, and then they allow Catholics to pretty much keep many of their traditions or just revise them slightly so that basically people can kind of just basically do what they want and practice the way they want to, whether it's Protestant or Catholicism. And this is important because it helps establish a relative religious peace in England, and it allows reforms to happen and so forth. But there are going to be, against Elizabeth I, pushes for other reforms. People are going to try to overthrow her, and England will ultimately, over this time period, actually struggle with problems with money. And this is actually important because it's going to lead to the idea during this age, the age of exploration, that America is an option and that England should be pursuing options to try to get to the Americas and establish colonies, because they see that the Portuguese and the Spanish are doing it as well, and obviously too the other powers of Europe like France. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. We'll talk a little bit more about the expansion of the Reformation into the rest of Europe and what it actually melds into in the next lecture. I'll see you in the next one.